October 25th, 1957. Room number 4, the Park Sheraton Hotel.
He never saw them come in. The towel was still warm on his face, steam curling toward the ceiling. His eyes were closed. For a man who had spent 30 years making sure he always faced the door, this was the one time he didn't. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he thought the barber's chair at the Park Sheraton was the one place nobody would come for him. He was wrong. 2 men walked in, scarves pulled up over their faces. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The first bullet hit him in the back of the head before the barber could drop his comb. Anastasia lurched forward, tearing the towel from his face. What happened next has become one of the most famous images in organized crime history. A dying man, half-blinded, swinging at his own reflection in the mirror. He thought the shapes in the glass were his killers. He was fighting shadows. 4 more bullets. Then it was over. Albert Anastasia, the man they called the Lord High Executioner, the Mad Hatter, the one man in the American underworld that other killers were afraid of, died on the floor of a barbershop in Midtown Manhattan. He was 55 years old. The towel was still warm. What you're about to hear is based on documented history. Court records, FBI files, congressional testimony, and the accounts of men who were there. Some conversations have been recreated for narrative purposes. Where the historical record goes silent, we've used informed interpretation. But the events are real, all of them. To understand how Albert Anastasia became the most dangerous man in the American Mafia, you have to go back. Not to the barbershop, not to Murder, Incorporated, not to the waterfront. You have to go back further than that. You have to go to a village in Calabria, Italy, where a boy named Albert Anastasia was born in the year 1802. The exact day isn't certain. Records from that part of southern Italy at that time were incomplete. What is known is that he was one of 9 brothers, that his father worked as a laborer, and that by the time Umberto was a teenager, there was nothing left for him in Italy. No work, no future, no reason to stay. So he did what thousands of young Italian men did. He got on a ship. He arrived in New York sometime around 1917. He was maybe 15, maybe 16. He came with one of his brothers. They jumped ship, entering the country illegally. No papers, no sponsor, no English. Just 2 boys from Calabria standing on the Brooklyn waterfront with nothing but the understanding that in America, a man could become whatever he was willing to become. Umberto Anastasia became Albert Anastasia. He changed the spelling, Americanized it, dropped the O for an A small thing. But it tells you something about him right from the start. He wasn't interested in where he came from. He was interested in where he was going. And where he was going at first was the docks. The Brooklyn waterfront in the 1920s was a world unto itself. If you didn't work the docks, you have no frame of reference for what it was like. The Longshoremen's Union controlled who worked and who didn't. Foremen decided each morning who got a shift and who went home hungry. The system was built on fear, favoritism, and kickbacks. A man's ability to feed his family depended on whether the right people liked him. It was, in every meaningful sense, already a criminal enterprise before the criminals even showed up. Anastasia showed up. He was young, he was strong, he was terrifyingly comfortable with violence. Within a few years, he'd established himself on the waterfront not as a worker, but as a force. He controlled hiring. He extorted union officials. He ran loan sharking operations among the dockworkers themselves, lending money at impossible rates and collecting with his fists when payments were late. By the time he was 20, the waterfront feared him. By the time he was 25, They belonged to him. But it wasn't the waterfront that made Anastasia what he became. It was a murder. In 1921, Anastasia killed a man. The details vary depending on the source. Some accounts say it was a fellow longshoreman. Others say it was a dispute over territory. What matters is that he was arrested, tried, and convicted. He was sentenced to death. Death row, Sing Sing prison, the electric chair waiting. And then something happened that set the pattern for the rest of his life. The conviction was overturned. Key witnesses either recanted or disappeared. A new trial was ordered, and by the time the second trial rolled around, there was nobody left willing to testify. The charges were dropped. Anastasia walked out of Sing Sing a free man. He was 19 years old. Think about what that does to a person. Not just the killing, not just the prison, the lesson, the takeaway. Albert Anastasia learned at 19 that if you eliminate the witnesses, you eliminate the problem. That idea would define the rest of his career. It would define Murder Incorporated. It would define an era, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The 1920s in New York were a free-for-all. Prohibition had turned the city into a war zone. Italian gangs, Jewish gangs, Irish gangs, all fighting for control of the liquor trade. The old Sicilian bosses, men like Joe Mafia, Joe the Boss, ran things the way they'd always been run, through tradition, through respect, through the old ways. But a younger generation was coming up. Men who didn't care about tradition, men who saw the business for what it was, business. Anastasia fell in with the Young Turks. His closest ally was a man named Charlie Luciano, Lucky Luciano. The two of them, along with Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and a handful of others, formed the nucleus of what would eventually overthrow the entire old order of the New York Mafia. But that revolution required blood, and blood was Anastasia's specialty. In 1931, the Castellamess War was tearing the New York underworld apart. Joe Mafia on one side, Salvatore Maranzano on the other. Two old-world bosses fighting for supremacy while the younger generation watched and waited. Luciano, who nominally worked for Mafia, had already decided that both bosses needed to go. The question was timing. The question was always timing. On April 15, 1931, Luciano invited Mafia to dinner at a restaurant in Kenai Island called Nuova Villa Tamaro. They ate, they drank, they played cards, and at some point Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. While he was gone, several gunmen entered the restaurant. Joe Mafia was shot 6 times. According to most historical accounts, Albert Anastasia was one of the shooters. Court documents from later investigations placed him at the scene. Witnesses, what few there were, described a man matching his build. The exact details remain debated among historians, but law enforcement at the time considered his involvement highly likely. 5 months later, Maranzano was killed in his office, stabbed and shot by a team of Jewish gangsters recruited specifically because Maranzano's men wouldn't recognize them. With both old bosses dead, Luciano restructured the entire New York underworld. He created the commission, 5 families, 5 bosses, rules, order, a corporate structure for crime, and Anastasia, the man who had helped make it all possible, became the underboss of the Mangano family under Vincent Mangano. He should have been satisfied. He wasn't, but that came later. First, there was the matter of killing, not the occasional necessary murder that every mob figure committed, something else entirely, something industrial. In the early 1930s, the leadership of organized crime in New York faced a practical problem. The commission had brought order. Disputes were settled through negotiation. Territory was divided. But there was still the question of enforcement. When someone broke the rules, who handled it? When a witness needed to disappear, who made the call? When a message needed to be sent in the most permanent possible way, who delivered it? The answer was Murder Incorporated. The name itself was a creation of the press, coined by a reporter at the New York World Telegram. The men who ran it never called it that. To them, it was simply the enforcement arm of the commission. A group of professional killers, mostly based in the Brownsville neighborhood of Brooklyn, who carried out contract murders on behalf of the organized crime leadership of the entire East Coast. And Albert Anastasia ran it. He didn't pull the trigger on most of the jobs. That wasn't his role. His role was operational. He received the contracts. He assigned the killers. He planned the logistics. He was, in the language of the organization, the Lord High Executioner, the man who decided how, when, and where people died. His chief lieutenant was a man named Louis Buchalter. Louis Lepke, they called him. Lepke ran the labor racketeering side while Anastasia handled the muscle. Below them were the triggermen. Abe Relez, Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, his real name was Harry, but nobody called him that. Happy Mayone. Dasher Abandando. Men who killed the way other men went to work. Routinely, professionally, without particular emotion. The numbers are staggering. Estimates of Murder Incorporated's body count range from 400 to over 1,000 kills during its decade of operation. 400 to 1,000. The exact number will never be known because the entire point of the operation was that bodies were never found, witnesses never talked, and connections could never be traced back to the men who gave the orders. They had methods. Pittsburgh Phil Strauss was said to have personally killed over 100 men. He used ice picks, rope, guns, fire. He once killed a man and buried him in the foundation of a building under construction. The body wasn't found for decades. Abe Relez, who they called Kid Twist, was considered one of the most efficient killers in the organization. He could walk up to a man on a crowded street, put a knife between his ribs, and keep walking. The victim would be dead before he hit the ground. Witnesses would later say they saw a man collapse. They never saw anyone near him. Anastasia oversaw all of it. He didn't lose sleep. According to people who knew him, and there weren't many who knew him well, he approached murder the way an executive approaches quarterly reports. It was output. It was productivity. The question was never whether someone should die. The question was efficiency, cost, risk. Anastasia wanted clean operations. He wanted no witnesses. He wanted no evidence. He wanted the person to simply cease to exist. There's a story, and it should be noted that the sourcing on this varies, but it has been repeated by multiple investigators and historians. Anastasia was watching television one evening, a news program. A man appeared on screen, a civilian, testifying before a committee about something entirely unrelated to organized crime. The man was talking freely, openly, cooperating with authorities. Anastasia reportedly turned to an associate and said something to the effect of, "I hate informers. That man is talking too much. He needs to go." According to this account, a contract was issued on a man Anastasia had never met, a man who had nothing to do with the mob, a civilian, simply because Anastasia saw him on television and didn't like the way he talked. Whether this specific story is completely accurate, historians continue to debate. What is not debated is that it was entirely consistent with Anastasia's character. He killed on principle. He killed on impulse. He killed because, to him, killing was the natural response to virtually any problem. The exact sequence of what happened next in Murder Incorporated's history. Accounts differ slightly depending on the source, but the broad strokes are clear. In 1940, Abe Relez was arrested on a murder charge. Facing the electric chair, he did the unthinkable. He talked. Kid Twist, one of the most prolific killers in Murder Incorporated, became a government witness. He gave up names, dates, methods, burial sites. His testimony led directly to the convictions and executions of several Murder Incorporated members, including his former partner Happy Mayone and Pittsburgh Phil Strauss. Lepke himself would eventually go to the electric chair, the only major organized crime boss in American history to be executed by the state. But Relez had more to say. He was prepared to testify against Albert Anastasia himself. He had direct knowledge of murders Anastasia had ordered. He could tie the Lord High Executioner to specific contracts, specific bodies, specific decisions. The case was being built. The prosecutors were ready. On November 12, 1941, Abe Relez fell from a window of the Half Moon Hotel in Kenai Island, where he was being held under police protection. He was on the 6th floor. He was supposed to be guarded by 6 police officers at all times. He went out the window anyway. The official ruling was that Relez was attempting to escape, possibly climbing down bedsheets tied together to reach a lower floor. This explanation was met with widespread skepticism. Relez was a cooperating witness who stood to benefit from testimony, not a prisoner looking to flee. The sheets were found tied in a manner that investigators later described as inconsistent with someone actually trying to climb down them. The press called him the canary who could sing but couldn't fly. Several investigations over the following decades suggested that Relez was thrown, that the police officers guarding him were paid to look the other way, that the order came from someone with enough power and enough money to buy cooperation inside a police protection detail. No one was ever charged. The case against Anastasia collapsed. Without Relez, there was no testimony. Without testimony, there was no case. Albert Anastasia, once again, walked free because the witnesses were gone. The pattern held. During the Second World War, Anastasia did something unexpected. He enlisted, or rather, he was drafted and he served. He became a United States citizen through his military service, which was ironic given that he had entered the country illegally decades earlier. His service record was unremarkable. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a disgrace. He was a soldier. Some historians have suggested that his military service gave him a veneer of legitimacy he'd never had before. Others argue it made no difference at all. The man who came back from the war was the same man who had left, possibly worse. After the war, Anastasia returned to his position as underboss of the Mangano family, and almost immediately, the tension that had been building for years between him and Vincent Mangano reached a boiling point. Mangano and Anastasia had never gotten along. They were fundamentally different men. Mangano was old school, conservative, careful. He resented Anastasia's independence, his volatility, his habit of making decisions without consultation. Anastasia, for his part, viewed Mangano as weak, outdated, an obstacle. The situation was complicated by Anastasia's relationship with Frank Costello, who by now was running the Luciano family in Luciano's exile. Anastasia and Costello were close, genuinely close. In a world where alliances were transactional, their friendship appeared to be something approaching real. Mangano saw this as a threat. An underboss maintaining an independent relationship with the boss of another family was a violation of protocol. It suggested divided loyalty. It suggested ambition. Mangano confronted Anastasia about it more than once. According to accounts from men who were present during some of these confrontations, the conversations were heated. Mangano accused Anastasia of plotting against him. Anastasia denied it, but the denials grew less convincing over time. In April of 1951, Vincent Mangano disappeared. His brother Philip was found dead, shot multiple times. Vincent's body was never recovered. Anastasia went before the commission. He told them that Mangano had been planning to kill him and that he had acted in self-defense. Preemptive self-defense. He killed the boss before the boss could kill him. The commission, led at this point by men who owed their positions to the revolution Anastasia had helped engineer 20 years earlier, accepted this explanation. Frank Costello vouched for him, and Albert Anastasia became the boss of what would eventually be known as the Gambino crime family. The Lord High Executioner now had his own throne. He ran the family the way you might expect, through fear, through violence, through the absolute certainty that disobedience would be met with death. His waterfront operations expanded. His union control tightened. Money flowed. The family grew. But something had changed in Anastasia, or maybe something had finally been revealed that was always there. Power didn't satisfy him. It made him hungrier and more dangerous. He began making decisions that alarmed the other bosses. He started selling memberships in the family. Made men, the most sacred designation in the Sicilian Mafia tradition, the honor that was supposed to be earned through years of loyalty and service. Anastasia was selling for $40,000, $50,000. Any associate with enough cash could buy his way in. It was an unprecedented violation of tradition, and it infuriated the other commission members. He entered the Cuban casino business without consultation, stepping on territory that belonged to other families. He made moves in the garment district, encroaching on operations run by Vito Genovese. He publicly humiliated associates. He threatened men who, under commission rules, were supposed to be untouchable. He was acting like a man who believed he was untouchable himself. This is the part of the story where Albert Anastasia's fate was sealed. Though he didn't know it yet, the men who would destroy him were already in motion. Vito Genovese was the primary architect. Genovese, who had returned from a self-imposed exile in Italy after the war, wanted control of the Luciano family. Frank Costello was in his way, and as long as Anastasia was Costello's ally, moving against Costello meant fighting a two-front war. The solution was obvious if you thought the way Vito Genovese thought. Remove Anastasia first. Then Costello would be alone. But Genovese needed help from inside Anastasia's own family. He found it in Carlo Gambino. Carlo Gambino, the name that would eventually define the family. In 1957, he was Anastasia's underboss. Quiet, patient, unassuming, the kind of man you could sit across from at dinner and forget was in the room. He smiled easily. He spoke softly. He waited. He had been waiting for a long time. Gambino's exact motivations are debated. Some historians argue he was genuinely concerned about Anastasia's erratic behavior threatening the family. Others suggest he had always intended to take the top position and was simply waiting for the right opportunity. The truth is probably both. Ambition and legitimate concern are not mutually exclusive. Genovese and Gambino reached an understanding. The details of their agreement were never recorded for obvious reasons, but the outcome was clear. Anastasia would be removed. Gambino would take over the family. Genovese would move against Costello without fear of retaliation. There may have been other conspirators. Some accounts suggest that Joe Prophesy, boss of another family, was involved. The exact coalition is hard to pin down. What's certain is that by the fall of 1957, Albert Anastasia was a dead man walking. He just didn't know it. He went to the barbershop. October 25th, 1957. The Park Sheraton Hotel, 7th Avenue and 55th Street in Manhattan. Anastasia arrived in the morning for a haircut and a shave. It was a routine he'd maintained for years. The hotel barbershop, same chair, same time. He settled in. The barber draped him with a white cape, applied a hot towel. Anastasia closed his eyes. The two gunmen entered. They wore scarves over their faces. The barber saw them first and stepped away. Some accounts say he was pushed. Others say he simply moved. Either way, he was out of the line of fire before the first shot. The first bullet struck Anastasia in the back of the head. He lurched upward, forward. The towel fell. He was hit again and again. He stumbled from the chair and lunged toward what he saw in front of him. The mirror. His own reflection. The shapes of his killers behind him, distorted in the glass. He swung at the mirror, at himself, at them. 5 bullets total, according to the medical examiner's report. He collapsed. The gunmen walked out. They were never identified. No one was ever charged with the murder of Albert Anastasia. The barber called the police. Anastasia was pronounced dead at the scene. The identities of the actual shooters have been the subject of decades of speculation. The most frequently cited names in law enforcement files and historical accounts include members of the Gallo crew from the Prophesy family, possibly acting on contract from Genovese. Stephen Armone and Stephen Gramorter have been named in various investigations. Joe Gallo allegedly boasted about his involvement years later, though Gallo was known for claiming credit for things he may not have done. What is known with reasonable certainty is this: Carlo Gambino did not pull any triggers. Vito Genovese did not pull any triggers. They didn't need to. That was the lesson Anastasia himself had taught the world. You don't do the killing, you order the killing. And when it's done, you step into the space that's left behind. Gambino stepped in. He became the boss. The family took his name, and the Gambino crime family would go on to become arguably the most powerful organized crime family in American history. Genovese moved against Costello. On May 2nd of that same year, actually months before the Anastasia hit, a gunman had already shot at Costello in the lobby of his apartment building. The bullet grazed his scalp. Costello survived, but he got the message. He retired, stepped aside. Genovese took control. The two architects got everything they wanted, and Anastasia got the barbershop floor. The aftermath played out quickly. Just 20 days after Anastasia's murder, the infamous Appalachian meeting took place. Dozens of mob bosses gathered at the estate of Joseph Barbara in rural New York to discuss the new power structure. The meeting was raided by state police. The resulting exposure blew the lid off organized crime in America in a way that had never happened before. The existence of the Mafia, which FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had denied for decades, was suddenly undeniable. Some historians have drawn a direct line from Anastasia's murder to Appalachian. The disruption his death caused, the power vacuum, the need for the other bosses to meet and restructure, led directly to the gathering that exposed them all. In death, Anastasia may have done more damage to the American Mafia than he ever did in life. But that gives him too much credit. He wasn't a strategic thinker. He wasn't a builder. He was a destroyer. That was his function and his limitation. His family barely mourned him. His wife and son retreated from public life. His brothers, several of whom had their own connections to organized crime, went quiet. The waterfront continued to operate. The unions continued to be controlled. The money continued to flow, just into different pockets. Albert Anastasia was 55 when he died. He had been involved in organized crime for nearly 4 decades. He had ordered or participated in, by conservative estimates, dozens of murders. By broader estimates, he was responsible for hundreds. He had survived death row. He had survived the Cassilames War. He had survived the collapse of Murder Incorporated. He had not survived his own nature. That's what it comes down to in the end. Not the conspiracy against him, not Genovese's ambition or Gambino's patience. Those were just the hands on the gun. The bullet was Anastasia himself, his volatility, his contempt for the rules he was supposed to enforce, his belief that fear was enough, that being the most dangerous man in the room was the same as being the most powerful. It isn't. It never was. Power in the Mafia, real power, the kind that lasted, belonged to men who understood restraint. Luciano understood it. Gambino perfected it. Even Costello, for all his flaws, understood that survival required subtlety. Anastasia never learned that lesson. He couldn't. It wasn't in him. He was a weapon, and weapons don't choose when they are used. They don't choose when they're discarded either. The Park Sheraton Hotel is gone now. The building still stands, but it's been renamed, renovated, turned into something else. Room number 4 of the barbershop is a memory. If you walk past 7th Avenue and 55th Street today, there's nothing to mark what happened there. No plaque, no sign, just sidewalk and traffic and people who have never heard the name Anastasia. The men who killed him are dead. The men who ordered his killing are dead. The men he killed are dead. The witnesses who refused to testify are dead. The witnesses who disappeared are dead. Abe Relez, the canary who couldn't fly, has been dead for over 80 years. What remains is the question, and it's not the question you might expect. It's not whether Anastasia was evil. He was. By any reasonable standard of human behavior, he was a man who caused immense suffering and felt nothing about it. That part is simple. The harder question is this: what does it mean that the system he operated within, the commission, the families, the structure that Lucky Luciano built, what does it mean that this system created him, used him, and then destroyed him when he became inconvenient? Anastasia didn't corrupt the Mafia. The Mafia made Anastasia possible. He was the logical endpoint of a system that resolved every problem with violence. He simply took it further than anyone was comfortable with. The monster they created. The monster they had to destroy. Some legacies are written in concrete and steel. Others are written in blood. His was written in both. And if you look closely at the history of organized crime in America, at the structures of power and fear that defined it for a century, you can still see his fingerprints, not on the institutions, on the fear. The fear was always his real legacy, not the bodies, not the waterfront, not Murder Incorporated. The fear, the knowledge that somewhere in the hierarchy, there was a man who would kill you for no reason at all, who would watch you on television and decide you talked too much, who would smile at you across a dinner table while planning the bullet. That fear outlived him. It outlived the commission. It might outlive the Mafia itself. If this story stayed with you, you know what to do.